Welcome, and it's great to see over 50 people have tuned in to what is set to be an informative and interactive webinar on early sown sorghum. Today's webinar will run for about an hour and is brought to you by a well-known team of researchers from both Queensland and New South Wales State Agricultural Departments and the University of Queensland, with the support and investment from the Grains Research Development Corporation. Hi, my name is Cara Klepper and I'll be chairing today's webinar. For those of you that may get distracted or have to momentarily step away, a recording of the webinar will be available and distributed after the event. No doubt you will have questions for our presenters, and you can ask these through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If someone gets in before you or someone asks a better question that you came up with, you can upvote the questions by clicking on the thumb icon. Presenters will have a couple of minutes after their presentation to answer your questions, and they'll also have another opportunity after all the presentations have finished. The researchers have requested your participation in a short 6-question poll towards the end of the webinar, after which we will then have the Q&A session with all panellists. So just remember to get your questions in through the Q&A icon located at the bottom of the screen. There'll also be an opportunity to ask questions through an email, but I'll tell you about that at the end of the webinar. So with housekeeping out of the way, let's get into it. Our first speaker, Daniel Rodriguez, will prepare you by setting the scene, providing an overview of the Sorghum Agronomy Research Program. Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks. My name is Daniel Rodriguez from WAFI's Centre of Crop Sciences at the University of Queensland. Why winter sown sorghum? Across the main sorghum growing region in Australia, the main limiting factors are the occurrence of water stresses and extreme heat conditions around flowering. This is because high temperatures and water stresses around flowering will reduce the number of grains formed per plant, which is the main determinant of final grain yield. So, avoiding stresses around flowering remains an important strategy to reduce the chances of low-yielding crops. Here, we propose that a winter-sown sorghum not only has the potential to avoid these stresses, but also to increase the number of sowing opportunities and the chances of double cropping a winter crop after a short summer fallow. However, before we can scale the recommendation of the practice, there are a number of questions that need answering. What is the impact of cold soils on crop emergence and establishment? Are there differences in cold tolerance between varieties? Does growing sorghum in winter affect root growth and function? What is the likely impact of frost? Are there benefits in yield and water use efficiency? What are the implications at the farming system level? So these questions are being investigated in a network of trials across New South Wales and Queensland, shown here by these dots on the map. The dots show the regional areas where we are operating, and the yellow background shows the sorghum growing region across Eastern Australia. The winter sown program consists of 3 main types of activities: lab and field seed biology studies on germination and crop emergence that are producing information to help farmers achieve uniform crop establishments in cold soils. We are producing quality data sets on farmers' fields to support farmers trying new practices, like planting a summer crop in winter. And we are also producing technical information and simple rules of thumb for farmers and consultants, as well as extrapolations across regions and seasons using the Absin model. In this first webinar, we have 5 speakers that will summarize the results from the first year of trials run from the Liverpool Plains up to central Queensland, So let me start by providing a brief summary of what we have learned so far. Then the other speakers will go into a bit more detail into specific topics and regions. This graph presents the results from the first year of trials. These trials consisted of the combination of 3 times of sowing from July to January, 4 plant populations and 6 commercial hybrids, and have been run across 8 sites. All treatments were replicated and the target plant populations varied between 3 and 12 plants per square meter. The graph shows the yield for each treatment in the y-axis versus the total plant available water at each of the environments. Remember, we call environment to the combination of site and time of sowing, as different times of sowing in the same site might have received slightly different total in-crop rainfall. Treatment yields varied between 200 kilograms per hectare to over 12 tons per hectare. And the different environments received between 250 and 800 millimeters of water, considering soil water at sowing, in-crop rainfall and irrigation. The most important message, I guess, from this graph is that across the range of available water, the treatments produced a very large yield difference, up to 50%. This is the difference between the bottom and top dashed lines in this graph. And such a yield difference translated into a near twofold difference in water use efficiency, from 8 kilograms per millimeter to up to 13 kilograms of grain per millimeter. Looking at yields and time of sowing, times of sowing varied between the 27th of July as the earliest and 17th of January as the latest. The winter sown sorghum tended to be yielding better or similarly than the later planting times across all sites. Note that in Emerald we lost the time of sowing 3 due to very hot and dry weather. So, why are we getting high yields in winter sown sorghum? We are sowing into cooler soils. This means that we might get less uniform emergence, which is not good. So, having access to good seed quality, it's very important. Within each site, except for Wara, most times of sowing had similar total plant available water. So, total plant available water was not a key driver, though rainfall distribution might have been different, as well as atmospheric demand. Temperatures around flowering were lower for the winter sown sorghum. This means that winter sown sorghum might have had reduced pollen sterility, usually caused by high temperatures around flowering. And finally, during flowering, winter sown sorghums accumulated more solar radiations and were exposed to lower temperatures, providing longer grain formation periods around flowering, formed more grains and had higher yield potentials. In general, we saw small effects of plant population, except on late plantings and in the wettest environment, in the irrigated in Surat. This graph is also useful to identify what are those combinations of hybrid and population that are sitting on top of the top line across the different levels of water availability. So, for the winter sown sorghum, the highest yielding combination of plant population and hybrid across the gradient of plant available waters. This is irrigated, mostly dryland, and dryland tended to have high plant populations. This is because sowing in cold soils will reduce the number of achieved plants. We will go into more detail on this in the next presentation. In general, there were very small differences in yield amongst the highest yielding combinations of hybrid and plant population. This analysis will be repeated, adding a second year of trial, and will be presented at our next seminar later in the year. So some take-home messages. Seed quality is the most important factor for uniform establishments when sowing into cold soils. Sowing into moist soils with more than 12 degrees of temperature at sowing depth in general achieved 70% of the target populations, though you have to mind for cold snaps and check for forecasts. Winter sown sorghum tended to yield more similarly than later sowing times. Initial results indicate important seed quality and plant density effects and smaller hybrid effects. Other presenters will show that important yield drivers in winter sown sorghum were higher harvest index and reduced screenings and lodging. We would like to acknowledge the contribution from the Grains Research and Development Corporation and the support of SAGI from DAF.
Thank you for a very comprehensive overview, Daniel. I was wondering if you could summarise why you think winter sown sorghum, early sown sorghum, can yield as high or even higher than main season sorghum.
Well, there is a number of factors. Primarily, we are growing the crop in a cooler time of the year. That means that the demand for water is much less. So we are achieving higher water use efficiencies. And we are also having longer periods of the panicle growth, which is giving us a higher potential grain yield. And the third factor probably is that we are avoiding some of the heat stresses that can cause pollen sterility around flowering.
Sure, great. We might get into our next speaker. Our next speaker is Joe Eyre. Joe works for QAFI, the University of Queensland's Institute for High Impact Applied Research in Agriculture. Joe is often out in the paddock, but today, with the help of pictorials, he'll outline the interaction that goes on between growth and development of the sorghum and water use, and some findings on sorghum germination and emergence for earlier times of sowing. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Cara. This presentation focuses on southern Queensland with inputs from the entire research team. The presentation is broken up into two sections. First, we use simulation modelling to define what is the sowing, flowering and harvesting times for these winter sowing. Then we look at how these timings influence soil-water balance. In the second part, we give some highlights on the findings in research on germination and emergence, screenings and returning for winter sown sorghum. These diagrams show crop development of the two conventional sowing windows in southern Queensland. The spring crop is sown late August to September, flowers in December and matures towards the end of January. Summer sown sorghum is sown in mid-December to January, flowers in March and matures in May. In southern Queensland, we define winter sown sorghum as sowing into a full soil moisture profile in late July to early August. The crop then flowers mid-November and matures late December to early January. For this crop, we're evaluating if we get increased sowing opportunities by extending the potential sowing window, the likelihood of cooler temperatures during sorghum flowering, the implications for water use efficiency, both of the crop and the cropping system, and the likelihood of increasing double cropping opportunities. It's important to note that the winter sorghum crop has matured before the heavy summer rains. In Warra, simulations show that sowing earlier the winter sorghum, we get a 80% chance of double cropping chickpeas versus about 20% of seasons for the summer sown crop. Early sowing increases the period from sowing to flowering. But the period from when the crop has 8 emerged leaves to flowering is only slightly longer. This is very important because most of the crop water use occurs when the canopy is large, and rapid canopy growth starts from approximately 8 emerged leaves. So this period from 8 leaves to flowering is when a lot of the water used that goes into grain yield occurs. In summary, the crop growth and development of winter sown sorghum in southern Queensland, it only flowers a few weeks earlier than the conventional spring sowing. But as Daniel showed, this is very important in terms of cooler periods for grain development. The pre-flowering growth phase is much longer, but the canopy is only big enough to deplete large amounts of soil moisture for a similar duration to the summer and spring sown crop. I'd like to emphasise that we are evaluating winter sown sorghum when the opportunity arises. That is, when soil moisture is full, not sowing in winter and hoping for rain. So, first of all, we wanted to know how often are we likely to get a full soil profile at the beginning of August. So we used simulation analysis to quantify how often the soil profile at Dalby has greater than 150 millimetres of stored soil water on the 1st of August, following a wheat crop, following a summer sorghum, and following winter sorghum's crop. We also compared the plant availability of water at sowing for winter, spring and summer sown sorghum following the same crop sequences. Rounded to the nearest 10%, simulation shows that the plant available water at sowing for the winter crop is greater than 150 millimetres in 60% of seasons following wheat, and reduces to 50% of the seasons following winter sorghum and 20% of seasons following summer sorghum. Because the spring is typically dry and with increasing rates of soil evaporation, it's not surprising that we do not find an increased proportion of seasons with plant available water greater than 150 millimetres for any of the fallows tested. However, delaying until summer does increase the frequency of having greater than 150 millimetres of plant available water at sowing for all the fallows. So in summary of the soil water story, we know that a longer fallow will increase soil moisture, but full soil moisture profile does occur in southern Queensland following some rotations. What we really need to know is what to do with it then, and is winter sown sorghum the answer? Simulated sorghum yields for Dalby with a full soil moisture profile at the beginning of August show there's very little difference in yield and the likelihood of yields less than 3 tonnes per hectare, which we define as a crop failure. We hypothesised that these simulations overestimate the percentage of winter sown sorghum crops with less than 3 tonnes per hectare, because the early sown crop has a larger root system that is better able to supply water to the crop during dry spells through flowering. Aaron Wilkes is testing this hypothesis and will speak on this subject later. To explore why the simulated yields are similar, we looked at the proportion of water lost from the system due to evaporation from the soil versus water that contributes to crop growth through transpiration out of the leaves. For the winter sown crops, 53% of the water contributed to plant growth and 47% of the water was lost through soil evaporation. Transpiration drops to 45% and 25% for the spring and summer sown crops respectively. When the soil moisture is full, system water use is maximised when crops are sown as soon as possible. So now I'd like to move on to some highlights of what we found. Last year we showed that fewer seeds germinate when temperatures are less than 15 degrees, especially for low vigor seed lots. However, all seeds germinated much slower when the temperature is less than 15 degrees, regardless of seed vigor. This season we tested seed lots that showed high and low emergence rates when sown in farmers' fields in late July. We found that seed lots with the best emergence rate also have very long shoot and roots. We're currently disentangling this seed lot and genotype interactions. Early sown trials to date showed lower screenings in southern Queensland despite higher tillering. Tillering is important because previous research has shown that most of our screenings are found on tillers. This graph shows that in one treatment, 15% of screenings were found in the tillers, compared with only 5% on the main stem. We also evaluated winter sown sorghum under irrigation at Surat. In this trial, yields of the earliest sown crop were 12 tonnes per hectare approximately for optimal population density, and yields decreased with later sowing times. But lack of water caused some of the low yields in the later plantings. The crop sown on the 28th of August was allowed to naturally dry down without chemical desiccation. Grain was harvested, stover slashed, re-fertilised, watered and allowed to return. The combined yields of the sown and returned crop showed in the dashed line that 17 tonne per hectare was possible. This season we'll repeat the trial as we believe there are more opportunities to further optimise this potentially highly profitable system. Some take-home messages. Winter sown sorghum in southern Queensland is sown in late July to early August. It flowers mid-November and matures in December, with the opportunity for a very efficient fallow during the summer and double cropping into a winter crop. Yields were similar across all the times of sowing when we had a full profile in August in a simulation analysis. Some of the highlights of the findings are that seed vigor rather than germination rate is a better proxy for winter sown sorghum rate, and this research is continuing. Screenings are mostly on tillers, and return crops yielded up to 17 tonne per hectare under irrigation.
Thanks, Joe. Joe, what are the implications of sorghum having a very long establishment phase?
The main one we're focusing on now that Erin's looking at is we believe that we hypothesise that even though the above ground shoots are not growing at a large rate, they're putting that energy into roots and developing the infrastructure to maintain growth maintain water supply to the plant during dry spells. We also hypothesise that the increased period somewhat increases the potential for branching in the panicle and therefore greater number of grains potentially and higher yields.
Sure. Joe, you spent a lot of time out in the paddock running the experiments and talking to growers. What do you think could be the impediments for growers to take up this early sown sorghum?
I think certainly establishment is a big issue. It takes a long time. And availability of the seed at that time of year. Also, we've got issues with once we can prove the system is reliable, the effects of frosts. What we've seen so far is that they've generally avoided or withstood frost when the plants are very small. However, we had frosts when the crop is much more mature. So that's a bit of an unknown. And also weed control in the system.
Great. A few hurdles to overcome then. As Daniel mentioned in his overview, the team are monitoring sorghum growth and development in different parts of the northern region. Our next speaker, Darren Aisthorpe, is based in Emerald with QDAF, Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, and he'll share the results of planting sorghum outside the traditional window in an environment where winters are mild and summers can be extremely hot. Thanks, Darren.
Winter Sown Sorghum in central Queensland, presented by Darren Aisthorpe, technical assistance by Jane Hour, as part of the DAF Regional Research Agronomy team. Spring sown sorghum in central Queensland is considered a high-risk proposition. Growers are under the belief they cannot plant until soil temps exceed 16 degrees Celsius, so this typically puts flowering for those crops between late October and early December, putting the crop at high risk of heat stress during that period. In 2018, a trial was sown at the Emerald Ag College to look at the effect of winter sown sorghum in central Queensland conditions. The green line on the graph shows the 8 AM soil temperatures over the duration of the trial. The green dotted line shows the 16-degree threshold that many believe that germination will be compromised if soil temperatures fall below. The red dotted line represents 35 degrees, or where many believe heat stress can be induced on the plant when temperatures rise above this level. Daily air temperature was also recorded during the duration of the trial, blue line representing minimum daily temperatures, the red line indicating daily maximum temperatures experienced over the duration of the trial. On the 25th of July 2018, the first sowing date occurred. This was followed a month later on the 16th of August with timer sowing 2. Timer sowing 1 flowered 84 days later, and timer sowing 2 flowered 73 days later. You will note that maximum air temperatures, particularly for timer sowing 2's flowering, were starting to exceed the 35-degree threshold. Unfortunately, both sowing dates overshot our target flowering period. Timer sowing 3 was sown on the 17th of January 2019. That crop flowered in 53 days under very hot, dry conditions. And again, it ran short of where it should have done for our optimum flowering period. As expected, emergence was slow, particularly for the first sowing date. The photo shows what the plants were looking like 36 days post-sowing at the end of August 2018. Actual plant emergence was pretty much on par, particularly for time of sowing 1 and time of sowing 2. However, emergence for time of sowing 3 did vary across the target populations. This image shows what the trial looked like 76 days after sowing on the 10th of October 2018. As you can see, heads are just starting to emerge. There had been no rainfall on the site since planting, and the crop was looking surprisingly healthy and resilient at that point in time. Not long after the previous image was taken, 105 millimetres of rain fell on the site over a 3-day period. This photo, taken 85 days or 10 days later, shows flowering well underway within time of sowing 1 and head emergence starting to occur in time of sowing 2. Note the extra tillers that have appeared since the rainfall. At 102 days past planting, you can see that time of sowing 1 was starting to colour up. Of interest, as you look up the main row in front of you, you will see the wide spread of heads on the plot nearest to you. As you look further down the row, you can see the heads are far tighter in a narrower row. This is a high population versus low population plant structure starting to present itself. Finally, this image shows time of sowing 1 and time of sowing 2 at 124 days after the original sowing date for time of sowing 1. As you can see, the maturity of time of sowing 2 has almost caught up with time of sowing 1, and both crops were sprayed out at the same time pre-harvest. As part of the biomass collection process, a range of data is collected to get a better understanding of different treatments' performance over the growing period. Data collected includes yield, total biomass, but also a breakdown of how the yield was produced, be it from tillers and main stems. The graph in front of you shows the contribution tillers are making to total yield based on each of the target plant populations in the trial. As you can see, at 30,000 plants per hectare, nearly 50% of the yield was coming from purely the tillers. As populations increase, contribution from tillers tends to decrease until you get down to 120,000 plants per hectare, where only 20% of the yield was produced by tillers for time of sowing 2, and less than 5% was produced for time of sowing 1. While performing the biomass cuts, sites like this were actually pretty common within the low population treatments. This particular plant was cracker, and we saw up to 32 tillers being collected from 8 plants cut in total. Yield calculations from the biomass cuts showed the trial yielded particularly well, with most treatments yielding over 4 tonnes per hectare and the top nudging close to 5. However, when the time came to put the header into the field, the yield results received from the trial header were actually much lower than the hand cuts, which raises the question, why? The biomass collection period should have given us a pretty fair indication as to what might have happened come harvest. The photo here clearly shows the effect of charcoal rot on the stems of certain plants. The stress during the flowering period certainly took its toll, and as a result, sites like this were commonplace among particularly 2 of the 8 hybrids that were used within the trial. Sowing date also played a big factor in the lodging effect. The graph here shows the percentage of lodging observed for each of the treatments for time of sowing 1 and time of sowing 2. A quick glance clearly shows that time of sowing 1 had lower lodging for every population range. Interestingly, lodging decreased the higher the population went for time of sowing 1. Yet for time of sowing 2, the higher the population, the higher the level of lodging. Time of sowing also seems to be having an effect on grain quality. The graph in front of you shows the effect on heads per metre squared that each population category had for each sowing date. As population increases, so too does heads per metre squared, and this is consistent for both trials and not terribly unexpected. However, what is a bit surprising is the effect on screenings that population has, particularly in time of sowing 1. As you note when you look at the line, even though the different levels are not statistically different, there's certainly a trend downwards in screenings the higher the population went for the July planted sorghum. However, when you look at the later August planted sorghum, the higher the heads per metre squared goes, the higher the screening levels go with it. So what have been some of the key findings of the research to date? Well, in central Queensland conditions, soil temps have actually had a minimal effect on emergence. And when compared to a hot planting in January, have actually been slightly better. The fears about frost damage on seedlings seem to be unfounded, and while emergence is certainly slower, we saw seedlings take frost events in temperatures below 1 degree and still keep going quite successfully. There was certainly a difference in plant structure, but flowering and grain fill in cooler conditions certainly improved yields and improved grain qualities. And probably the elephant in the room that we haven't really touched on yet is the possible farming systems benefits that could be related to being able to sow in July, giving growers a cropping option in the later half of the year with the ability to into a wheat crop the following year, which is something that we did in April 2019. The benefits stem from being able to sow sorghum in July, giving growers the cropping option in the second half of the year if moisture was available. The added benefit, for CQ in particular, is that this system will allow growers the option to double crop back into winter crop the following year. If summer rains are favourable in January to March, providing a lower risk double cropping option as average rainfall for the period should be sufficient to refill the profile to allow planting to occur. This is something we were able to do for the July and August sowing dates in April of 2019, producing a crop which averaged over 3 tonnes per hectare and provided some interesting preliminary combined water use efficiency figures for that period, as can be seen below. I'd like to acknowledge our project partners for this work, QAFI and New South Wales DPI. I'd also like to acknowledge GRDC and DAF for funding the Central Queensland trial. Big thank you to all cooperators who supplied seed for our trials. It was greatly appreciated. And finally, a big thanks to our DAF Research Agronomy technical team, who all hooked in and gave us a lot of help, particularly when that fund biomass cut was taking place.
Thanks, Darren. It's certainly a complex system in which we work. Given you've just planted the first time of sowing in CQ for the 3rd year of this project, how confident are you, given the complexities that you just outlined, that winter sorghum will be a viable proposition for growers in your part of the world?
Thanks, Cara. It's never going to be a every year type of scenario, but it certainly has a really nice fit. As I said in the presentation, we've got a lot of cropping options in CQ, but probably the big gap in our system is a later half of the year crop. When we do have particularly a wet winter, we've got fallow country ready to go. Once we get past end of May, we see our wheat yields drop away pretty quickly. So growers have the option, do they want to put a late wheat crop in or possibly an early sorghum crop might be a really nice fit in there. And preliminary data is showing that the sorghum may comfortably out-yield the wheat. And the added benefit again is that follow-on crop afterwards, the system benefits of that crop going forward. So the opportunity to double crop in a relatively guaranteed, but a much safer way than you might have done previously.
So weighing up the impediments that Joe outlined earlier and the farming system benefits that that are possibilities, real possibilities in your environment, are many growers actually adopting this practice of sowing sorghum outside the traditional window?
It's a little bit early yet, and I'm certainly not pushing people to race out and do it. We've got to get the agronomy right. Having a full profile of moisture at the start is absolutely paramount. We learnt that in the 2019 trial. But I think there's a lot more advantages there, and there's a lot of people looking over the fence watching very closely. So I think there's potential, but I'd like another year or two of trial data just to make sure that's right before people go too hard, too early.
Sure, certainly watch this space.
Absolutely.
Now moving south in the quest to test hypotheses in contrasting environments, our next speaker needs no introduction. Based in Tamworth with New South Wales DPI, Loretta Seraphin has been involved in sorghum and maize research for many years. Like Darren, Loretta will outline the growth and development responses observed in sorghum planted outside the traditional sowing window. Thanks, Loretta.
I'm Loretta Seraphin, Research Agronomist Summer Grains with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries based in Tamworth. Today I'm going to be talking about the results from the Northern New South Wales node. Over the last 2 seasons we've been running a series of trials across Northern New South Wales. These sites have stretched from as far north as just over the border at Bullawarrie north of Mungandai down to Breeza on the Liverpool Plains. Each of the trials has included 3 factors. Firstly, time of sowing. We've tried to establish sorghum at a super early or a winter sowing time. So that has typically been late July or early August at the Moree and Mungandai sites, and early September at the Breeza site on the Liverpool Plains. An early time of sowing, which has typically been around 3 weeks later. And finally, a normal time of sowing, which has been around early September, or when soil temperatures have reached 16 to 18 degrees. So at Breeza on the Liverpool Plains, that has tended to be towards the end of October, in contrast. The second factor we've used has been targeting a range of different plant populations. We've targeted 3, 6, 9 and 12 plants to the square metre. And thirdly, we've used a range of different commercial hybrids. And at each of the sites, that's typically been between 8 and 9 hybrids. So what do the results so far say? Firstly, if we look at soil temperatures, there have been 2 important messages. You need to monitor your soil temperatures carefully, as rapid fluctuations can and do occur in the late winter and early spring period when we're targeting soil temperatures of 12 degrees. This means it's very important to use accurate forecasting tools to target the soil temperatures of 12 degrees and rising, and this should be measured at 8 AM each day. And ideally we're looking for soil temperatures that are going to be rising above 12 degrees for a period of at least 7 days following planting. If you look at the example of the soil temperatures from Bullawarrie in the 19 and 20 season below, what you'll see is that time of sowing 1, which was at the end of July, was planted as we were looking at an approaching rising front. But following planting, soil temperatures crashed and became much lower than 12 degrees. And there were large fluctuations evident over the following weeks. In contrast, by the time we got to time of sowing 2 in early September, you could see that there was definitely a rising front and that those fluctuations were starting to be minimised. If we look at seed quality, we can see that it's important to obtain high germination and vigor seed, as planting into cold soils is an additional stress on seedlings. We also need to ensure that seed has appropriate seed treatments to protect it against pests and diseases, because we know it is going to take longer for emergence to occur. Next, if we look at plant establishment. From the research trials that we've conducted, we've seen that losses can be up to 50% of the amount of seed which is actually sown in very cold conditions. So that is where soil temperatures have been down as low as 8 degrees and lower for a prolonged period of time after planting. As a result, if you're going to be planting into very cold soils, you need to consider your target plant population. And while I'm not recommending that you plant below 12 degrees Celsius, even at 12 degrees, you should consider planting some additional seed to compensate for potential losses. Losses at low target plant populations can easily mean gappy stands and a reduced yield potential. And when your target population is, for example, only 3 plants per square metre, losing one plant or failing to see one plant emerge will have a much bigger impact than if your target plant population is 5 plants per square metre. Ultimately, we want to aim for a uniform and rapid establishment of at least 80% of the seed that we're planting, or better. If we look at the growth and development of the sorghum crop, we can focus on a couple of different aspects. Firstly, from planting early, we know that we'll see a longer vegetative period. So that means it's going to take more days to reach flowering. This is due to the fact that plant growth will be slower when we plant it earlier as the temperatures are colder. However, what we're trying to achieve with super early or winter sown sorghum is actually moving the flowering window earlier than it normally would be. As you can see from the example of Ponjola in the 2018-19 season, in the blue box you can see the flowering period from Thomas sowing 1, so that was in the first week of August. You can see that flowering has commenced there at around the middle of November. In contrast, when we delayed our planting by around 3 weeks, we can see that in the green box the flowering period has moved slightly further back, and when we've planted at a more typical 16 to 18 degree target soil temperature, again we see that the flowering period is moved later into the mid-December and late December period across the range of hybrids we've utilised. If we look at the differences between the hybrids that we've included in our trials, what we can see is that when we've planted at the very early sowing time, at Thomas sowing 1, that generally there's a much larger difference in the days taken for a variety to actually reach 50% flowering in comparison to our Thomas sowing 3, or our normal planting time, where we see that the gap between the different lines of the hybrids is much smaller. We also notice that it's taking much longer for hybrids to reach 50% flowering from the first time of sowing. In particular, for a slow maturity variety like MR Apollo, it's taking around 115 days to reach flowering at Thomas sowing 1. In contrast, by the time we've moved to Thomas sowing 3, it's taking a little over 80 days for Apollo to reach flowering. There have also been significant impacts on grain yield. The earlier planting dates have more often resulted in high yields, even if we've actually had a poorer plant establishment from that super early or winter sown sorghum. We've also seen that harvest has been moved earlier from this super early sowing time, and that has been as early as mid to late January at the sites at Moree. We've also seen impacts on grain quality. So planting earlier has generally resulted in decreased screenings, increased 1,000 grain weights, better test weights, but also small reductions in grain protein. So to summarise, early sowing is still going to be a balancing act. It's not all going to be positive and it's not all going to be negative. But generally, we've seen that early sowing has shown better yields and a reduced risk of heat stress through moving the flowering window further forward, thus enabling earlier grain fill and harvest. In some seasons, we know that early sowing could be the difference between sowing a sorghum crop or not sowing at all, or having to switch crop species. Earlier sowing also allows increased opportunity for double cropping following the sorghum, and in situations where we see these increased yields, that ultimately has meant increased profit. On the downside though, there are negatives to be managed with early sowing. Slower emergence and a longer vegetative period will result the earlier you sow. You need to monitor your soil temperatures carefully and realise that really anything below 12 degrees is quite risky, and that temperatures below 10 degrees will result in slow and patchy emergence. The risk of frost damage to seedlings is still there, although we haven't seen a lot of frost damage over the last couple of seasons. That's not to say that it won't occur though. Also, we're aware that earlier sowing means that there's still the opportunity for a range of winter weed species to actually germinate and potentially compete with early sown sorghum. And finally, seed quality is more important, so you need to be more careful in ensuring that your seed is of a good quality, germination and vigour. Finally, we need to say a big thank you to our trial cooperators and the seed companies. We also need to acknowledge the team at B&W Rural and HM Ag for their assistance. And lastly, thanks to the New South Wales DPI technical team for their support.
Thanks, Loretta. For Western regions such as Mungandai, will early sowing be enough for growers to be able to achieve or reliably achieve sorghum yields?
I don't think it will be the total solution for that environment, but I think it will be a very important component of improving the reliability of sorghum in that Western region. I think overall it will still need to be an integrated package, so we'll still need to look at other agronomic management levers that we can use, things like varying plant population and the hybrid type. But definitely if we could actually reliably plant at least a month earlier than what they're doing currently, and move that flowering window forward out of that very high temperature zone, then I think we would have some great benefits to show.
Certainly sounds like the downside risks. I'm not sure, is there feedback there? The downside risks of planting sorghum so early. Joe talked about it, and you've shown some evidence of it. In an area like the Liverpool Plains where it's so safe, why would you bother with early sown sorghum in that sort of environment?
That's a good question, but I think what we've seen on the Liverpool Plains is not dissimilar to what we're seeing across the rest of northern New South Wales, where particularly over the last 5 years we've seen very hot summers and often very dry summers, and that's been the same on the Liverpool Plains. So really what we're hoping to provide growers within that environment is the opportunity to either move their sowing window forward, so their flowering window is away from that high risk period at the end of December and January, and obviously giving those growers who are on the Liverpool Plains a greater opportunity to increase their double cropping and actually try and include more crops in their rotation, because they are in a favourable area, and so we need to make the best use of the rainfall that they actually have.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Loretta. Our last speaker and member of the research team is Erin Wilkes. Erin holds a PhD in agricultural ecology and a master's in international agricultural development from the University of California, Davis. Erin has applied farming systems analysis to identify targeted management and development strategies for farmers in Eastern and Southern Africa, and more recently across the Northern Grains region. Today, Erin will whet your appetite for information with her research investigating sorghum water capture. Over to you, Erin.
Hello, I'm Erin Wilkes. I am a research fellow based at UQ Gatton, where I work with Daniel Rodriguez, Joseph Eyre, and Peter DeVoyle. I'd like to thank Loretta, Darren, and Joe for their review of the field trials and the seed germination work. I'm now going to switch gears and discuss water use patterns in winter sown sorghum. This adds value to the trials conducted by Loretta, Darren, and Joe because water use may be key to explaining differences they've observed in winter, spring, and summer sown sorghum. Since we're still processing the first season of data, I'm presenting the methods we've developed. So if you're interested in the results, you'll have to stay tuned for our next field day. We are collecting two critical pieces of information over 2 seasons, and that's soil moisture and root volume. And we're collecting these at specific depths down to 3 meters. We're comparing these data across times of sowing and water stress conditions. We're asking, first, if water uptake around flowering varies across times of sowing. So we're comparing water uptake in winter, spring, and summer sown sorghum. If we see differences in water uptake, we'll then ask if those differences are explained by differences in root growth and function. And we're focusing on water stress at the flag leaf stage because this is a critical stage of development for yield outcomes. Based on previous field trials, we expect winter, spring, and summer sown sorghum to have the same amount of roots. However, the roots of winter sown sorghum will go deeper. The diagram shows root systems and water uptake at the flag leaf stage for winter, spring, and summer sown sorghum. The blue area reflects the amount of water taken up by the plant between 0 and 3 meters. Simply, water uptake will reflect root density. We expect that the benefits of winter sowing will be greatest when we have a full soil water profile. Roots will not develop deep into dry soil, so water uptake under water stress conditions will be more similar across the 3 times of sowing. Our on-farm field trial is located in Cecil Plains, Queensland, where we have access to a reservoir that we use for the water unlimited treatment. The plots we are looking at are in the orange cells. We're looking at a subset of plots that are part of a larger field trial that Joe manages. The larger field trial includes multiple varieties and planting densities. We're only looking at Buster and a plant population of 9 plants per square meter. We're estimating water uptake by measuring electrical conductivity down to 3 meters in the soil using a geophysical surveying instrument. The instrument gives readings for 9 specific depth levels so we can determine how water is distributed in the soil profile, rather than just the total water under our feet. We take consecutive measurements that we compare, and that allows us to determine water uptake. After we measure water uptake, we collect root samples. We take a total of 6 soil cores from each plot, and we divide the soil core into 9 depth fractions. We wash the roots to remove the soil from the roots, and scan the roots to measure root volume. So far, we've completed the dual EM surveys, and we need to calibrate the instrument in order to convert electrical conductivity readings into plant available water. We're also still in the process of scanning the root samples. I'd like to acknowledge all the help we've had, especially with washing the roots, from our casual assistants Rajandeep Singh, Wenjing Zhang, and Lyndon Wells. Thank you also to the GRDC for the financial support for this project.
Thank you, Erin. And we look forward to seeing some more results after a few more seasons of data. Just a question for you. How much can electrical conductivity measurement really tell us about water availability to the plant, especially across different soil types?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It it doesn't give you a value for the amount of water in the soil, but what we've done so far with this data, since it's not calibrated yet to get plant available water, although it will be, we have been able to compare values from one measurement to the next, and that gives us an indication of how much water is taken up in the soil. And that is still an indication that we can use to compare times of sowing and see if there's more water uptake that in one time of sowing than another.
Almost like a relative measure. Fantastic.
Yeah.
And how broadly can we apply the lessons that have been learnt in this experiment from this, like across in different environments?
Yeah, so we are looking at a black clay soil that we're working on, and there's and so in many ways we're limited to similar soil types, likely because roots and water uptake are influenced by these soil characteristics. What I do like about the trial that we're working on is, although I'm just looking at root samples for Buster at a plant density of 9 plants per square meter, we are looking at the water uptake across the entire larger field trial. So that covers, I believe, 9 or 8 varieties and different planting densities. So so there is a little bit more richness there that we can look at.
Fantastic. It's very exciting work, and it complements the broader program really well. I'd like to open it to the panelists for some questions, and I appreciate that not everyone can put questions into the Q&A icon, especially if you're on a mobile device. I said earlier that you can submit questions via email, and you can do that probably over the next 24 to 48 hours just by responding or replying to the registration email that you received to this webinar. So please do that, and the panelists have kindly agreed to publish a newsletter from this webinar with key messages from the webinar, and also they will be able to answer your unanswered questions in that newsletter. So keep an eye out for that in your email inbox, possibly your junk mail, social media, and even the project website. Daniel, question up for you. So what are the team's plans for the upcoming season, and where will the trials be located?
Well, the plans for this season, we have 8 sites: Liverpool Plains, Moree, Mangandai. We are in Cecil Plains, we are in Surat, and we are in Emerald. So, and the plan is to repeat exactly the same design that we had in the previous 2 years. So at least we have 3 years of a very solid data set that is very uniform, and that is what statisticians like. And so that we can really have very, robust conclusions. And in the meantime, there will be more studies on seed biology that Joe will be conducting, and the whole process is that we're going to be analyzing the data, and the data, the main objective is to really produce simple rules for farmers that they can apply to make decisions. So basically our role is just to put up the information there and provide options to growers. So the final decision is going to be made by the grower based on good evidence of what is likely to happen.
Great. Joe, you had a question come up in the Q&A around not actually getting a cold frost on top of your little seedlings. I know they're dear little plants to you, but have you experienced really cold temperatures or even frosts on top of some of your experiments? What's sort of the range that you've experienced?
We had minus 3.7 at Warrior one season. Mm-hmm. That we had almost no damage whatsoever that we could see, other than the plants went purple, but they also went purple in November. So there is a question about whether that frost is actually, that's measured at 1.5 metres above the soil, whether the plants are actually protected by the soil mass down at that low level. So whether the frost is actually affecting them. But there is also another question as to the stage. We know that sorghum is very sensitive to cold flowering, but we're seeing that certainly in the vegetative stage is a lot more tolerant. It is a important question that we need to look at, but as Daniel said, we need to focus on the questions that we have, get them answered, and then move on to the next component. But we'd really love to work with anyone that's interested in looking at more detail in frost.
Great. Loretta, you mentioned weeds coming up at the same time that we might be thinking about planting sorghum. How is the research, I guess, handling that, assessing that?
I think it's one of the emerging issues that we see could potentially have an impact on the ability of growers to actually implement early sowing sorghum. Certainly in paddocks that have a high weed burden, particularly things like black oats, then that's going to have to be a consideration, because we know that the current control options are limited. So, the number of options you have at the moment for actually managing those weeds that are emerging at the same time as your early sorghum are pretty slim. So I think going forward, as this program develops and probably more people look at including early sowing of sorghum into their rotation, then I think it's going to be an area that might require some additional work.
Right, noted. I'm certainly talking to the crop protection people in GRDC. Just as a general question to those that might want to answer this one, I'm not going to direct it to anyone in particular. If I was a grower, given that it's getting colder and given that we're in June now, we haven't had, well, particularly on the downs, we haven't had a lot of water to plant a winter crop. If I wanted to be planting sorghum into cold soils this year, what should growers take into account, in summary?
I have basically 3 points primarily. One, paddock selection, very important. Initial soil moisture, we mentioned several times that you need a really full soil profile. Having the advantage of having a stubble will reduce a bit the evaporative losses that are not really huge, but having such extended vegetative periods, having stubbles that can reduce those evaporative losses is a plus. And soil temperatures higher than 12 degrees at least, and increasing. And it's important that if you're planting today, just look at the forecast, because if you have a cold front coming, sometimes it might be better just to wait a week and let that pass, so that we have at least 2 weeks of increasing soil temperatures. The second point that is extremely important, as been mentioned, is seed quality. So seed has to be tested. Be good. We do have seed companies listening to us, so we're really good to have differential products that they have a higher quality, specifically designed for winter sown sorghums. That would be really amazing. And also we saw that we needed to give it a bit more a notch up to the plant density, so up to 30%, because if we are planting into cold soils, we're going to lose plants. So up to probably 30%, assuming a 30% loss is probably reasonable. And so basically those 3 points: paddock selection, mind the seed quality, and plant densities.
Thanks, Daniel. Very comprehensive answer for an unscripted question. I'm sure you would agree the panellists have given us much food for thought and a feeling of watch this space as more of the experimental data gets consolidated and measures come out for growers. On behalf of everyone attending today, I would like to thank and congratulate them on a job really well done. That concludes today's webinar on early sown sorghum, and we sincerely hope that you got something out of it and something from it. Thank you for your attendance.